Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're anything like us, you are probably just exhausted by the modern food landscape. I mean, we're constantly hit with conflicting headlines about nutrition, right? One week it's fear carbs, the next you're supposed to load up on keto snacks. Then it's all about protein powders or some new superfood. It feels like an information war, and honestly, the consumer, well, we're losing. So for this deep dive, we dug into a source that really tries to simplify all this culinary chaos. Michael Pollan's 2008 classic, In Defense of Food, An Eater's Manifesto. It's a fascinating book as it argues the solution isn't actually more science, but, well, less.
Yeah, it's quite something. What's really striking is how Pollan tackles this subject, which is, tangled up in massive industrial complexity, billions of dollars, and he boils it down to something almost revolutionary just through its sheer simplicity. I think the New York Times nailed it when they called the book brilliantly written and deeply important. It just fundamentally shifts the whole conversation away from isolated nutrients and brings it back to culture and, frankly, common sense. He basically argues that all the anxiety, all those conflicting studies, the marketing noise, you can bypass it completely if we just adopt these three powerful, really memorable rules.
Right. And that's the absolute core of his philosophy, isn't it? It's what guides our whole deep dive today. It's his manifesto, this three-part mantra, and probably the most valuable thing for you to take away. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. It sounds, well, it sounds so easy. It's almost kind of offensive in a way. So our mission here is to figure out why this incredibly simple advice is actually a really profound rejection of decades of nutritional science and this huge industrial food system, the one that Pollan says created what he calls edible food-like substances.
Exactly. And before we can even get to eating real food, we kind of have to understand what we've been eating instead and the mechanism that made it all possible. Pollan coins this term, nutritionism.
Okay, nutritionism. Let's unpack that because it sounds sort of scientific, but Pollan uses it almost like an insult, doesn't he? What is it exactly, and how does it connect to, well, poorer health?
Right. So nutritionism, fundamentally, it's the belief, or maybe the ideology, that the value of a food comes only from its isolated chemical parts. Its fats, its carbs, the vitamins, the proteins we can measure. It takes something complex and whole, like, say, a carrot, which has thousands of compounds interacting in ways we don't fully understand, and reduces it down to just a list of nutrients you can put on a label. And here's where the big money comes in. This focus. It's a golden opportunity for food companies. If they can train us, the consumers, to only look at those isolated nutrients, then they can take really cheap raw materials, think corn, soy, strip them down, process them heavily, and then just fortify them back up with whatever nutrient is trendy at the moment. Add some fiber, maybe some vitamin D.
So the argument is, instead of selling us, say, a whole potato, they can sell us these highly processed potato flakes. They take out all the good stuff, add back a cheap vitamin or two, and then market it like it's a health food.
Precisely. That's the game. They compete on these single nutrient claims, low fat, high protein, zero cholesterol this, added that. It completely distracts you from the basic fact that the underlying stuff isn't really food anymore. It's highly refined, maybe artificially colored, packed with sugars and salt. We stopped eating food, Pollan says, and started chasing chemicals. And that's right when, historically, our collective health started going downhill.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim. But hang on, isn't that a bit impractical? I mean, if I have a specific health issue, like high blood pressure, shouldn't I be looking for low sodium labels? It feels like Pollan's asking us to just ignore potentially useful information.
Well, yes and no. He's advocating for ignoring the industrial information in favor of, let's say, biological information. His point is, if you stop buying the processed stuff altogether, the need to become a detective scrutinizing sodium levels mostly disappears because whole foods, an apple, a fish, they aren't generally overloaded with sodium in the first place. What he's really attacking is the whole system that forces us to need to become amateur chemists just to navigate a grocery store aisle.
Okay, I see the distinction.
And this system feeds directly into what he calls the tragedy of the Western diet. It's characterized by, huge amounts of refined grains, industrial sugars, processed vegetable oils, and lots of processed meats. It's a diet basically engineered for profit margins and long shelf life, not really for human health or metabolism.
And the sources we looked at explicitly link this kind of diet, this high sugar, high refined, everything industrial standard, directly to the explosion in chronic diseases we're seeing. Things like obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, even depression, and some cancers. It's presented as a really unhealthy trade-off.
Absolutely. And if you look globally, the contrast is pretty stark. You take traditional diets, Japanese, Mediterranean, various indigenous diets. They can be wildly different from each other culturally, right? But they tend to share this critical common ground. Lots of plants, whole foods, unprocessed ingredients. And those cultures, historically, have shown dramatically lower rates of these Western diseases.
And the industrial deception, as Pollan frames it, kind of thrives on the chaos, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They actually benefit when the nutritional advice keeps changing, push the latest fear, avoid fat, cut carbs. Because every time the advice shifts, it creates an opening for a whole new line of expensive, fortified, processed products designed to meet that new fear.
Exactly. The whole setup is almost designed to keep you confused, maybe a little anxious, and dependent on their labels and claims. Think about it. What do nutrition labels, fortified cereals, those bold health claims on boxes really do? Often they act like a shield for the product itself. They distract you, the consumer, from asking the most basic, fundamental question. Wait, has this thing been processed so much it's not even really recognizable as food anymore?
Okay, so if the problem is this nutritionism and all the confusion it creates, then the solution, Pollan's radical solution, lies in that first rule: eat food. It's about reclaiming the original meaning of what we should be putting into our bodies.
Right. And he offers this wonderfully simple test, like a defense mechanism for when you're feeling overwhelmed in the supermarket. Real food is something your great-grandmother would recognize. If she wouldn't know what it is or maybe where it came from, chances are it's one of those edible food-like substances.
Okay. That's a clear image.
And that leads to some immediate practical rules. First, if a product needs to shout about its health claims, high in omega-3s, you should probably be a little skeptical. Real food, like a head of lettuce, it doesn't need to advertise that it's healthy, it just is. Second, try to ignore products that need a massive ingredient list. And if it does have a list, avoid the ones with names that sound like they came out of a chemistry lab, not off a farm or out of a kitchen.
But again, is that really practical in today's world? Are we supposed to ignore all the information producers give us, especially when so much processed food is, let's face it, cheap and heavily subsidized? It feels almost irresponsible.
Pollan argues we have to ignore a lot of it because it's designed to manipulate, not just inform. He's basically teaching defensive shopping strategies. Think about the supermarket layout itself. That advice to shop the outer aisles where the fresh produce, the meat, the dairy usually are, it's a kind of spatial tactic, right? It helps you avoid the center aisles, which are packed with the highly processed, fortified stuff where the confusion and, frankly, the big profit margins live.
That makes sense. It's a physical way to filter.
Yeah.
And this naturally pushes us away from just being passive consumers towards, active preparation.
Yeah.
He really emphasizes buying whole ingredients, cooking at home more, maybe trying to eat more locally and seasonally when possible. It's about reclaiming cooking as like a meaningful cultural act, not just a chore.
Absolutely. And that act of reclaiming connects beautifully to the next piece of the mantra, the one about what our meal should actually be made of, mostly plants. The sources are really clear on this. Diets that are centered around vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, they consistently correlate with lower rates of chronic disease all around the world.
Okay, mostly plants.
And it's important to clarify, mostly plants doesn't automatically mean strict veganism or vegetarianism is the only way. Animal products have been part of many traditional diets for a long time. But culturally, they were often treated very differently. Think about it. In many traditional societies, meat wasn't the huge centerpiece of the plate like it often is now. It was more of a side dish, maybe a flavoring, a condiment almost.
That's a really important distinction. Side dish versus the main event.
Right.
Okay, now let's touch on that cultural wisdom idea. This often gets glossed over, but Pollan puts a lot of weight on it, contrasting the stability of cultural food traditions with the constant churn of modern nutrition science.
Yeah, this might be one of the most profound parts of his whole argument, actually. He looks at traditional diets, whether it's in Italy or Okinawa or wherever, and sees them as the result of culture and evolution working together. They're the product of countless small choices made by communities over thousands of years. They're stable. They've been field tested, you could say, by generations of healthy people.
Right, tested by time.
Now contrast that with modern food science. Like you said, there's a new study practically every week contradicting the last one, often driven by funding, focusing on single variables, isolating one nutrient in a lab. Pollan basically suggests we should place more trust in the collective wisdom embedded in those long-standing traditions. Our ancestors knew what food was through experience and intuition. way more than we trust the perpetually shifting advice of today's experts who might be influenced by industry.
Wow. Okay. So the complexity itself is part of the problem, and the solution is partly looking back, trusting that accumulated knowledge. That flows perfectly into the last part of the mantra, not too much. How does shifting back to real food help with, well, portion control?
It's fascinating because modern processed food is often literally engineered to bypass your body's natural signals that say, okay, I'm full. It's designed to be hyper-palatable, melt in your mouth, gives you that instant bliss point hit without actually triggering the satiety cues in your brain and stomach effectively. It's engineered to make you want more, to make you overeat.
And real food,
Yeah.
it does the opposite.
Pretty much. Real food tends to be more fibrous, it requires actual chewing, it's more nutrient dense in a complex way. When you start eating those kinds of ingredients again, and maybe slow down a bit, your body's natural ability to regulate how much you eat, to tell you when you've had enough, it tends to just restore itself. Things like mindful eating, cooking your own meals, eating slowly, sharing meals with others, these cultural habits. They are the original portion control, much more effective than, say, a calorie counting app.
Okay, so pulling it all together, the core philosophy here is really a profound return to simplicity. It's not some complicated, restrictive diet plan that's all about deprivation. It's more like a set of common sense navigational rules for a food world that's actively designed to profit from keeping us confused.
Exactly. And that brings us right back to that paradox Pollan highlights. The more we worry about nutrition, the less healthy we seem to become. His message is ultimately you don't need the constant tracking, the miracle superfoods, the endless anxiety. We probably need our real ingredients, more mindful habits, and maybe rediscovering some of the actual joy in eating.
So by rejecting the whole marketing structure of industrial food, we're actually reclaiming a degree of control over our own health and maybe our relationship with food itself. But let's push this one step further because the sources really urge us to see the bigger picture. We need to talk about the final crucial lesson. Food is political.
Oh, absolutely vital. What you choose to eat doesn't just impact your own body. It has ripple effects on the planet's health and even the structure of our society. Think about the industrial diet. It relies incredibly heavily on vast monocultures, huge fields of just corn or just soy. This depletes the soil, requires massive inputs of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and really damages ecosystems in the long run.
Right. So when Pollan encourages eating locally, maybe organically when possible, he's directly linking personal health to environmental responsibility. The industrial system often prioritizes cheap calories above all else, regardless of the environmental cost. Whereas eating more plants, choosing whole foods, supporting local farms, that tends to support more diverse agriculture, healthier soil. Our food choices are kind of like casting an environmental vote 3 times a day.
Well said. And that industrial system, it thrives on being cheap, convenient, and keeping things confusing. It has effectively externalized so many of its true costs, the cost to the environment, the long-term cost to our health, even the cost of the time that's been stripped away from traditional cooking and eating practices.
So if Pollan's right that all this complexity is largely driven by profit, and that the biggest source of our anxiety is this industrial replacement of actual food with edible food-like substances, what's the single most revolutionary thing you think we could do?
That's a great question to ponder. If the answer lies in trusting collective wisdom over confusing lab science, maybe the most profound change isn't about obsessing over one more label. Maybe it's something simpler, like intentionally bringing back the communal slow dinner. You know, that time where we actually share food that our hands prepared, not a factory machine.
That's definitely something to think about. Reclaiming both health and a bit of our shared humanity around the table. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.